This message did not appear because your life is falling apart. It appeared because the part of you that used to obey the old life is no longer answering when it calls. And that may be the reason everything feels strange right now. You may still be waking up at the same time, driving the same roads, answering the same messages, sitting in the same rooms, doing the same work, and smiling in the same careful way, but something inside you has quietly stepped back. The old rhythm still exists, but it no longer has the same authority over your soul. The things that once made you feel safe now feel too small. The approval that once gave you energy now fades after a few seconds. The roles that once made you feel useful now feel like rooms with the lights turned halfway off. You are not imagining this. Something in you is withdrawing its power from the life that trained you to survive, but never truly allowed you to become whole. In the language of Carl Jung, this is often the moment when psychic energy begins to leave the persona, the social mask you built in order to be accepted, needed, admired, or left in peace. For a long time, that mask may have helped you. It helped you get through difficult seasons. It helped you be strong when people expected you to be strong. It helped you keep a job, hold a family together, remain polite, stay reasonable, avoid disappointing others, and move through the world without causing too much trouble. But a mask that protects you for too long can become a house with locked doors. At first, you are grateful for the shelter. Later, you begin to realize you cannot breathe there. And now, perhaps without any dramatic event, the electricity in that old house is beginning to fail. The hallway is dimmer. The mirrors do not reflect you the same way. The rooms where you once performed your identity are becoming quiet. This is not laziness. This is not weakness. This is not you becoming ungrateful for the life you have. It may be the deeper self refusing to keep feeding a version of you that was created mostly from fear. Fear of being rejected. Fear of falling behind. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear that if you stop holding everything together, everything will collapse. But beneath that fear, another intelligence is beginning to rise. Some people call it the unconscious. Some call it the soul. Some call it God's timing. The unseen moment when what is false begins to lose its grip, so what is true can finally come forward. And this is why the message found you now. Not to give you a prediction, but to give language to a shift you already feel. Your old life may still be standing, but it no longer rules you in the same way. And before you rush to fix the discomfort, you may need to ask a quieter question. What part of me is no longer willing to live behind a locked door? You may notice it first in the smallest moments, not during a crisis, not when anything obvious has gone wrong, but in the quiet spaces where you used to feel automatic. You sit in your car before walking into work, with the engine already off and your hand still resting on the keys, and for a few seconds you cannot make yourself move. Nothing terrible is waiting for you inside. No emergency, no disaster, just the same office, the same inbox, the same conversations, the same performance of being capable. And yet something in you feels as if it has stopped applauding. You still do what needs to be done. You answer the email. You join the meeting. You give the reasonable response. You laugh at the right moment. You keep your tone calm. You do not collapse. You do not create drama. From the outside, no one would know that the old motivation has begun to drain from the room. But inside, the part of you that once felt rewarded by being seen as dependable, composed, agreeable, or impressive has grown strangely quiet. This is one of the first signs that the inner structure is changing. Not because you have become careless, but because the old currency no longer buys your soul. Praise still arrives, but it does not reach the same place. Someone tells you that you are strong, and instead of feeling proud, you feel tired. Someone thanks you for always being there, and instead of feeling loved, you feel the weight of how long you have been available. Someone says you are the kind of person everyone can count on, and a deeper question rises in the dark like a door slowly opening. But who am I when I am not being useful? This is where Jung would ask you to look beneath the surface. The persona is not evil. It is necessary. Every person needs a way to move through society, to work, to belong, to communicate, to be understood. But when the persona becomes the only self you are allowed to live through, the real inner life begins to suffocate behind it. You may still be functioning, but functioning is not the same as being alive. You may still be admired, but being admired is not the same as being known. You may still be needed, but being needed is not the same as being free. And perhaps this is why the days feel so strange. The outer life continues, but the inner witness has changed. The part of you that once believed survival was enough is beginning to ask for meaning. The part of you that once accepted emotional crumbs is beginning to hunger for truth. The part of you that once confused peace with keeping everyone else comfortable is beginning to understand that silence can also be self-abandonment. This does not mean you must destroy your life in order to find yourself. It means you have reached a threshold where the old way of living cannot hold all of you anymore. Like a house at night, where one room after another loses power, you begin to realize that the darkness is not only frightening. It is revealing. It shows you where you have been living without warmth. It shows you which rooms were never truly yours. It shows you how much energy you spent keeping lights on for people who never asked whether you had enough light left for yourself. And once you see that, you cannot fully unsee it. You may still walk the same hallway tomorrow morning, but something in you will be listening for another door. This is the point where the language of Carl Jung becomes useful, because what is happening inside you is not simply a mood, and it is not only burnout in the ordinary sense. It is a change in authority. For years, your persona may have been sitting on the throne of your life. The persona is the social face, the polished self, the version of you that knows how to be acceptable in a room, how to answer without revealing too much, how to keep the peace, how to look steady even when something deeper is asking to be heard. It is not a false thing in the simple sense. It was built for a reason. It helped you survive school, work, family expectations, friendships, disappointment, pressure, and the quiet demand in American life to keep moving even when your inner world is asking you to stop. Your persona learned the rules. Be productive. Be easy to understand. Do not need too much. Do not make things complicated. Smile when the room expects lightness. Keep your voice calm. Stay useful. Stay impressive. Stay in control. And for a long time, this may have felt like maturity. It may have even brought rewards. You became the person who could handle things. The person who remembered the details. The person who answered at 11 o'clock at night. The person who could be trusted to keep going when others slowed down. But Jung would say that a problem begins when the mask no longer serves the soul, but replaces it. A tool becomes a ruler. A garment becomes skin. A role becomes a prison with comfortable furniture. And then the deeper self, the center of your wholeness, begins to withdraw its energy. Not because it hates the life you built, but because it knows that life cannot be allowed to define the whole of you anymore. This is why you may feel strangely distant from things you once chased. It is not always that the outer thing is bad. The job may still be respectable. The relationship may still look peaceful. The routine may still be efficient. The city may still look beautiful through your windshield on a clear morning. But the psychic energy that once flowed into those things has begun to move elsewhere, toward the parts of you that were left in the basement of the personality. The quiet longing, the creative instinct, the honest anger, the need for rest, the desire to be seen without performing, the wish to live from truth instead of constant adaptation. This is not the death of the persona. You will still need a social self. You will still need responsibility, manners, work, timing, and discipline. But the old face can no longer be king. It can no longer decide what your entire life is allowed to be. And when this shift begins, it often feels like confusion because the old leader has lost authority before the new inner order has fully appeared. You are between worlds. One room has gone dark, but another has not opened completely. That space can feel lonely, but it is also sacred. It is the threshold where the unconscious begins to return what the persona had hidden. And often, it does not return as a loud command. It returns as a dream, a memory, a sudden dislike for what once felt normal, or a quiet question that follows you through the day. What part of me have I been asking to disappear so that this version of my life could continue? Emily Carter began to notice the dream before she was willing to admit what it meant. She was 36, a project manager at a media company in Portland, the kind of woman people trusted because she could turn confusion into order. Her apartment was clean, her calendar was full, her bills were paid on time, and from the outside her life looked like a quiet success. She had a favorite coffee shop 3 blocks from her building, a reliable parking spot near the office, a small circle of friends who called her grounded, and a reputation at work for never letting things fall apart. But for 3 weeks, almost every night, she dreamed of the same house. It was old, not frightening, just silent in a way that felt too familiar. The floors were dark wood. The windows were covered with thin curtains. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, and at the end of it there was one locked room with warm light coming through the crack beneath the door. In the dream, Emily always stood a few feet away from that room, holding a key she could not bring herself to use. Then she would wake up before opening it, staring at the ceiling while the blue light of dawn slowly entered her bedroom. At first, she blamed stress. She told herself it was just another busy quarter, another round of deadlines, another season where everyone needed something from her. But the dream kept returning, and during the day, small things began to touch her more deeply than they should have. A coworker praised her for being the person who always kept the team stable, and instead of feeling appreciated, Emily felt a heaviness gather behind her chest. Later that evening, while washing a coffee mug in her kitchen, she suddenly stopped with the water still running and whispered, "I am tired of being the stable one." The words startled her because they did not sound dramatic. They sounded true. That was the beginning of the crack. Not a collapse. Not a sudden decision to leave everything behind. Just a clear line appearing in the wall of the life she had carefully maintained. In Jungian language, the dream was not random. The unconscious often speaks in symbols because the conscious mind is too defended to hear direct truth. The old house was not only a house. It was the structure of Emily's identity, the life she had built out of responsibility, competence, and self-control. The locked room was the part of her that had been waiting for years, the creative self, the tired self, the honest self, the self that did not want to be useful before it was allowed to be real. And the light under the door meant something in her had not died. It had only been shut away. This is what happens when the deeper self begins to rise. It does not always arrive by destroying your outer world. Sometimes it simply makes the old arrangement impossible to ignore. You can still attend the meeting, still answer the phone, still buy groceries, still make polite conversation, but something inside keeps pointing to the door you have avoided. Emily did not understand all of this immediately. She only knew that the life she had called stable was beginning to feel like a house, where one room had been waiting too long to be opened. What Emily began to meet behind that inner door was not a darker version of herself in the way people often misunderstand the shadow. It was not something dangerous waiting to ruin her life. It was the collection of everything she had learned to hide in order to remain acceptable. The anger she swallowed because she did not want to seem difficult. The exhaustion she renamed discipline because she was afraid rest would look like weakness. The creativity she postponed because practical people around her had always treated imagination like a luxury. The loneliness she covered with competence. The tenderness she protected by becoming useful. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the shadow. It is not only the part of you that is flawed or uncomfortable. Very often, it is the part of you that was never allowed to belong to your conscious identity. If you were praised for being easy, your honest no may have gone into the shadow. If you were rewarded for being strong, your need for support may have gone into the shadow. If you were loved most when you were helpful, your desire to be chosen without performing may have gone into the shadow. And when the old life begins to lose its power, those buried parts do not politely ask for permission to return. They rise through irritation, dreams, sudden tears, unexpected honesty, and a deep refusal to keep pretending that everything is fine. For Emily, it started one Thursday afternoon in a conference room with glass walls and a long table covered with laptops, coffee cups, and printed reports. A client changed the direction of a campaign for the third time that week, and everyone looked at Emily because everyone knew she would absorb the pressure and reorganize the entire plan. Usually she would smile, take notes, and say, "Of course, we can make that work." But that day, before her practiced voice could step forward, something quieter and truer rose inside her. She looked at the timeline, then at the room, and said, "We can adjust, but not without moving the deadline or removing 2 deliverables." The room became still. No one was angry. No one rejected her. The world did not end. Yet Emily felt her heart beating as if she had crossed a bridge she had avoided for years. That small sentence carried more meaning than it seemed to carry. It was not only a professional boundary. It was a piece of her shadow coming home. It was the part of her that knew fairness. The part that knew limits. The part that had been waiting under the locked door with a lamp in its hands. That evening, She walked home through a light Oregon rain, past storefront windows and wet sidewalks, reflecting the city lights, and she felt something unfamiliar, not happiness exactly, but relief. The old self would have felt guilty. The old self would have replayed the meeting for hours. The old self would have wondered if she had disappointed someone. But this time, the guilt came and did not rule her. It passed through like weather. And beneath it, Emily sensed a deeper truth. The shadow was not trying to make her cruel, selfish, or reckless. It was trying to return the parts of her that could make her whole. The next test came quietly, the way old patterns often return, not as a disaster, but as an invitation to become the person you used to be. On Friday evening, Emily was still at her desk after most of the office had emptied out, watching the lights of Portland blur through the windows as rain moved softly across the glass. Her phone lit up with a message from Daniel, a former coworker who had always known how to lean on her without naming it as leaning. He wrote that he was overwhelmed with a freelance project and wondered if she could take a quick look over the weekend. It sounded harmless. It was only a few files, maybe an hour or two, and there was a time when Emily would have said yes before even asking herself whether she had the energy. The old self would have felt chosen by being needed. The old self would have confused access with closeness. The old self would have turned someone else's urgency into her own responsibility. But that evening, her hand paused above the screen. Something inside her recognized the doorway. This was not only a request. It was a familiar room in the old house, one where she had spent years proving her worth by becoming available whenever someone knocked. Jung would say that the ego often tries to pull a person back into the known pattern just as the deeper self begins to separate from it. Not because the ego is evil, but because the ego fears the unknown. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar freedom. The mind says, at least I know how to be this person. At least I know how to be useful. At least I know how to be admired for giving more than I can afford. And when you are standing at the threshold of change, the old life may return through very ordinary things. A message, a compliment, an opportunity, an old fear, a person who benefits from the version of you that never had boundaries. It comes back to see whether it still owns your reflexes. Emily read Daniel's message twice. She felt the familiar guilt rise, then the familiar urge to explain, soften, overgive, and make sure he did not feel disappointed. But beneath that reflex, another voice was present now, quieter but steadier. It did not shout. It did not shame her. It simply asked, if you say yes, will it come from love or from fear of losing your place in someone's mind? That question changed the room. She put the phone down, closed her laptop, and walked to the small kitchen near the elevator. The office was nearly silent except for the hum of the vending machine and the distant sound of traffic. For several minutes, she stood there with a paper cup of water, letting the discomfort move through her without obeying it. This was new. In the past, discomfort had been a command. If she felt guilty, she fixed it. If she felt anxious, she reached out. If she felt responsible, she carried more. But now the feeling was only a feeling. It did not have the authority to write the next sentence of her life. When she returned to her desk, she replied with kindness and clarity. She told Daniel she could not review the project over the weekend, but she hoped he found the support he needed. No long explanation. No emotional apology. No offering to help later so the boundary would seem softer. Just a clean no. After she sent it, her body reacted as if she had broken an ancient rule. Her chest tightened. Her thoughts searched for danger. She imagined him thinking she had changed, that she was less generous, less warm, less reliable. But nothing happened. The city kept moving. The rain kept falling. Her phone stayed quiet. And in that quiet, Emily understood something she could not have understood before. The old life does not lose power because it disappears. It loses power when it appears again, and you no longer kneel before it. After Emily sent that message, she expected peace to arrive. Immediately, as if one honest boundary would open the sky and make everything simple. But the next morning, she woke before sunrise with a strange heaviness in her body. The apartment was quiet. The city outside had not yet begun its full noise. A thin gray light rested on the walls, and for a few minutes she lay still, wondering why doing the right thing could feel so unsettling. This is where many people misunderstand transformation. They believe that once they choose truth, the soul should instantly feel free. But often, The first feeling after choosing differently is not freedom. It is exposure. You have stepped out of an old agreement, and the nervous system still expects punishment. You have stopped serving a pattern, and the ego still believes you are in danger. In the language of faith, this is also where divine timing begins to reveal its deeper meaning. God does not always remove an old life from you because you failed inside it. Sometimes He allows its power to fade because it has become too small for the person He is forming in you. The closing of a familiar door is not always rejection. Sometimes it is protection from a version of safety that was quietly costing you your soul. The loss of desire for an old role is not always ingratitude. Sometimes it is mercy. Sometimes God, or the unseen order of life, begins to make certain places feel less comfortable so you will stop mistaking captivity for peace. Emily did not have language for all of this as she made coffee in her small kitchen, but something in her was beginning to understand it. For years, she had thought being needed meant being loved. She had thought being praised meant being aligned. She had thought stability meant staying where no one questioned her usefulness. But now those meanings were loosening. It was as if an invisible hand had begun to turn down the volume on everything that once controlled her. The approval still came, but softer. The guilt still came, but weaker. The fear still came, but it no longer sounded like the voice of God. And that difference mattered. Because not every inner voice deserves obedience. Some voices are old fear wearing holy clothing. Some voices are childhood strategies pretending to be wisdom. Some voices are the persona trying to keep its crown by calling every new movement dangerous. Jung would say that individuation often feels like betrayal before it feels like wholeness, because to become yourself, you must disappoint the false gods that trained you to remain divided. The god of being liked. The god of being needed. The god of never making anyone uncomfortable. The god of staying small enough to be easily understood. Emily stood by the window with her coffee cooling in her hands, watching headlights move along the wet street below. She did not suddenly know the future. She did not receive a complete map, but she felt one quiet truth settle in her chest. Perhaps life was not taking something from her. Perhaps life was returning her to herself. Perhaps the discomfort was not a punishment, but a passage. And if God was closing the rooms where she had learned to disappear, maybe it was because somewhere within her, a door meant for her real life had finally begun to open. Emily did not change her life by throwing everything away. That would have been the old ego trying to turn awakening into another performance, another dramatic proof that she was finally free. Instead, she began with something smaller and more honest. She opened a window before deciding whether she needed to leave the house. On Sunday afternoon, after a slow walk along the Willamette River, she came home, placed her phone on the kitchen counter, and took out an old notebook she had found months earlier in a box beneath her bed. The cover was worn at the edges, and between the pages were fragments of a younger self she had nearly forgotten. Short reflections, unfinished essays, lines about loneliness, questions about God, sketches of rooms filled with light, and one sentence written years ago in blue ink. I do not want to spend my whole life being impressive while feeling unknown. Emily sat at the small table by the window and read that sentence several times. It did not accuse her. It simply waited for her. That evening, she gave herself 20 minutes to write. Not for work, not for a client, not for anyone who expected her to sound polished, but for the part of her that had been quiet for too long. At first, the words came slowly. She wrote about the dream house. She wrote about the locked room. She wrote about how praise could sometimes feel like a beautiful cage. She wrote about how tired she was of making herself understandable before making herself honest. 20 minutes passed, then 40, and for the first time in a long while, time did not feel like something chasing her. It felt like a space opening around her. This is how real transformation often begins. Not with a grand escape, but with one faithful act that gives the self room to breathe. A person does not always need to abandon the outer life immediately. Sometimes the deeper work is to bring truth into the life that already exists and watch what can survive it. Emily still went to work on Monday. She still joined meetings, still answered messages, still managed timelines. But something was different. She stopped volunteering for every extra problem. She stopped explaining her boundaries as though they were crimes. She stopped telling her dreams to people who had only ever known how to make her doubt herself. She signed up for a Saturday writing class at a community center 15 minutes from her apartment, and when the confirmation email arrived, she felt a quiet brightness move through her, like light entering a room that had been closed all winter. None of this looked dramatic from the outside. No one would have called it a breakthrough. But inside, the old arrangement was changing. The persona was still present, but it was no longer alone in the room. The shadow had brought back her limits. The self had brought back her longing. The soul had begun to speak in ordinary actions. And this is important because many people wait for a huge sign before they honor what they already know. They wait for the perfect timing, the perfect courage, the perfect plan, the perfect guarantee that no one will misunderstand them. But divine timing often does not arrive as a thunderous command. Sometimes it arrives as enough honesty for the next small step, enough strength to say no once, enough tenderness to write one page, enough clarity to stop asking the old life for permission to become real. Emily was not leaving the house yet. She was opening a window, and through that window, for the first time, she could feel fresh air entering the place where her soul had been waiting. Weeks passed, and the change in Emily did not announce itself to everyone at once. It moved quietly, like morning light spreading across a room before anyone names it dawn. She still lived in the same Portland apartment. She still walked past the same coffee shop on her way to work. She still carried a laptop bag over one shoulder and checked the weather before leaving because Oregon rain could turn a clear morning into gray by lunch. But inside, something had rearranged itself. The life around her had not collapsed, yet it no longer stood above her like a judge. The old need to explain herself had weakened. The old panic that came when someone seemed disappointed had lost its sharpness. The old habit of measuring her worth by how smoothly she kept everything running had begun to feel like a language she once spoke fluently but no longer wished to live inside. And this is the quiet ending many people miss, because they expect transformation to look like a new city, a new job, a new relationship, a completely different face in the mirror. Sometimes those things come later. Sometimes they do not. But the deeper transformation begins at the moment you stop asking the old life for permission to be real. For Emily, the proof came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Her manager asked if she could take over another urgent project because, as he said, she was the only person who could keep it from becoming messy. A few months earlier, those words would have pulled her back into the familiar trance. She would have felt special, needed, almost chosen by pressure. She would have stayed late, canceled her writing class, carried the extra weight, and called it responsibility. But this time, she listened to her body before she answered. She felt the old reflex rise, but it did not become her. She felt guilt, but guilt did not become command. She felt the desire to be praised, but praise did not become food. Then she said calmly that she could help define the priorities, but she could not own the entire project without removing something else from her plate. Her voice did not shake. The room did not freeze. No dramatic consequence arrived. And as she walked back to her desk, she understood that the real miracle was not that everyone approved. The real miracle was that approval had stopped being the door to her inner peace. Jung would call this a movement toward wholeness, not perfection. Individuation is not becoming someone impressive. It is becoming someone undivided. It is the slow and sacred work of allowing the ego, the persona, the shadow, and the self to find their proper places, so no single part rules the whole life out of fear. The persona still has a place. Emily still knew how to be professional, kind, organized, and thoughtful. But the mask was no longer sitting on the throne. The shadow still had a place. Her anger, limits, longing, and tiredness were no longer enemies to be buried. They had become messengers. The ego still had a place. It could plan, decide, and move through the outer world. But it no longer pretended to be God. And the self, that deeper center Jung spoke of, had begun to guide not through noise, but through alignment. Through the quiet sense of what opened her and what made her shrink. Through the difference between fear and truth. Through the growing refusal to betray her inner life just to preserve an outer shape. One Saturday morning, after her writing class, Emily stopped by the river and sat on a bench with a paper cup of coffee warming her hands. The air was cool, and the water moved steadily beneath the bridges. She thought about the dream house that had followed her for so many nights. Strangely, she had not dreamed of the locked room in several weeks. Then, that night, the dream returned, but it was different. She was standing in the same hallway, holding the same key. The floorboards were still dark, and the house was still quiet, but the fear was gone. She walked to the end of the hall, placed the key in the lock, and opened the door. Inside, there was no hidden disaster, no impossible demand, no frightening truth waiting to swallow her. There was only a simple room filled with warm light, a wooden desk near the window, blank pages, green plants, and a white curtain moving softly in the breeze. Emily stepped inside and realized the room had never been trying to trap her. It had been waiting for her to return. When she woke, the sun had just begun to rise over the city. For a long time, she did not move. She only watched the pale gold light reach across the wall and understood something with a calmness deeper than excitement. Her life was not finished becoming. She had not solved every question. She still had work to do, fears to meet, choices to make, and days when the old patterns would call her by name. But she was no longer the same person who believed she had to disappear in order to be safe. That was the threshold. That was the irreversible change. Not certainty, but remembrance. Not a perfect future, but a soul no longer asleep behind a locked door. And perhaps this is what happens when a former life begins to fade from the inside. It may still be visible around you for a while. The same streets, the same responsibilities, the same people, the same calendar. But its invisible power breaks when you stop confusing survival with destiny. It breaks when you can feel fear and still choose truth. It breaks when you no longer offer your deepest self as payment for belonging. And when that happens, life may not become easier immediately, but it becomes more honest. You begin to understand that God was not asking you to become someone else. The universe was not demanding that you abandon everything in a single dramatic act. The deeper movement was always this: to return the scattered pieces of yourself to the center, to let the false lights dim, and to trust the quiet dawn that begins when the real life inside you finally finds a door and opens it.